Okay then my friends, so the first type of control flow that I want to talk about are loops. And in particular, we're going to talk about one type of loop. Now there's many different types of loops in JavaScript. I do think it best that we just focus on one of these, a for loop, to begin with, then we'll talk about the rest of them later on. So I'm going to write out this for loop first of all, then after I've written the loop, I'm going to explain it and show you how it works. So I'm saying let I equal 0, then a semicolon, then I is less than 5, semicolon, then I plus plus, then we open and close some curly braces like that at the end. Now, we don't add a semicolon at the end of these curly braces. We don't do that for loops, all right? Now remember, at the end of the day, the job of a loop is to loop through a portion of code over and over and over a set number of times. That's what they're there to do. So keep that in mind when we go through this. So first of all, this thing here, when we open the curly braces and we close the curly braces, that is what is known as a code block. It's just a section of code that we're kind of sectioning off, and it's for this loop, okay? Now then, we create the for loop by first of all saying the for keyword. Then we have some parentheses, and inside the parentheses, we have three different things. The first thing right here, this is an initialization variable. So we're saying to begin with, we're going to create this variable I and set it equal to 0. Now this variable is a bit like a counter, and it keeps track of how many times we cycle through the loop and how many times we run the code inside the loop. Then the second thing is a condition. This is going to evaluate to either true or false. If this condition is true, then we're going to execute the code that's inside this code block. If it's false, then we're not going to. The third thing over here, this is a final expression, and this is going to execute every time at the end of the code block. Okay, so every time we loop through some code at the end, we're going to take I and add 1 to it. So let's run through this. The code reaches the for loop and we set I equal to 0 to begin with. Then we check this condition, is I less than 5? Well, yes it is, because it's currently 0. So then we execute some kind of code that's inside this code block. We've not got any there yet, but later we will. Then once we've executed that code, we come up to this final expression. We take I, which is currently 0, and we add 1 to it. So now that's saying, okay, we've been through here once, essentially. So we come back up to the top. We don't reinitialize the variable. We just keep I as 1 because we've just added 1 to it. And we recheck the condition. Is I still less than 5? Well, it's 1. So yes, it still is less than 5. So we execute the code block again. And at the end, we do this final expression, we add 1 to I, and now it becomes 2. Then we go back to the top. Is 2 less than 5? Yes, it is. So we do the code block, and it loops and loops and loops until eventually I is 5. It's no longer less than 5, so then we don't execute the code inside the code block anymore. We've already looped through it enough times based on this condition, so we don't do it again. Then once we've done it, we come out of the loop and we carry on down the file with the rest of the code, okay? So then let's see this in action. I'm going to say inside here console.log, and we're going to say in loop colon, and then we'll also log a second thing to the console, which is I. So remember, I is 0 to begin with. Then every time we go through the loop, it's going to add 1 to I. So we should see 0 to 4. We won't see 5 because at the point when I is 5, it's not less than 5 anymore, and it doesn't execute the code in here anymore. At the end of it, I'm also going to do another console log, and I'll say loop finished. So this is only going to run once we've looped through this X amount of times. So save it and preview over here, and we can see in loop 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Then we break out of the loop because I is not less than 5 anymore, and finally we log this to the console. So I hope that makes sense. Now, a lot of the times, we might not know how many times we want to loop through something. We're not just going to pluck a number from thin air and say, okay, I want to loop through you 10 times. No, we don't do that. Typically what we do is loop through data of some kind. So we could get, for example, a list of users or names from a database. We don't know how many people are in that list or array of names, and we want to cycle through them. And we want to perform a for loop, for example, for each name in that array and do something with that name. So let me comment this chunk out and come down here. And what we're going to do is create a constant. Now we're not going to grab these names from a database because we've not touched that yet, but what we will do is just create an array and imagine that we've got these from a database, okay? So the first name is going to be Sean, then I'll say Mario, and then Luigi. Okay, so now we have our array of names, and we need to give this const a name, so we'll call it names. And now I'd like to cycle through this array using a for loop, okay? Now remember, I said we might not know how many elements are inside here. We know it because we can just look at it and say, well, there's 3 inside there, so we know how many times we want to cycle through it. But just suspend disbelief for a minute and imagine we got this from a database and you don't know how many names are inside here. We need another way to tackle this. So the way we do it is by saying for, first of all, we still initialize a variable to be 0 to begin with. That's our counter. Then we say for I less than names dot length. So that's going to take the length of this, which is 3, and it's going to say for as long as I is less than that value, then we're going to cycle through it. And that ensures that we're going to cycle through each one. Does that make sense? Cool. So finally, we take I and we plus plus to add 1 at the end of every loop. Okay, so inside here, I'm just going to console.log I to begin with. Now we should know what happens here. It's going to be 0, then 1, then 2, and then that's it. Okay, because when it gets to 3, the length is 3 and it's no longer less than that. So then, I don't just want to log out I now. I want to log out the name that we cycle over each time. Okay, so first Sean, then Mario, then Luigi. How do I do that? Because this is not automatically linked to this. All we're doing is using the length property at the minute. What we want to do is every time we go through this loop, log out the names in order. So what we could do is we could take the names and we could use square bracket notation to get each element. And what I'm going to pass in here is I. Now I to begin with on the first loop is going to be 0 because that's what we initialize it to be. So when we first execute this code, I is 0 and it's going to log out Sean. Then we add 1 to I and come back to the top. When we run this code block again, I will now be 1, so we'll get this element and log that to the console and so forth. So if we save this now and preview, we can see all of these names. So that's cool, right? We can now cycle through an array of any length. We don't have to know that length using this kind of syntax. Now imagine instead of just logging this to the console, we wanted to do something like create a little snippet of HTML, a little template for each name, so that eventually we're going to output that to the browser. Well, we could do something like this. Let HTML equal to a template string, which is backticks, remember, and inside that template string, we could just write some HTML. I'll do a div tag and close that off. Then what we want to do is output the variable, this thing, names I, inside this div each time. So remember, to output a variable inside a template string, we use $, then the variable name inside the curly braces, and we want names and then I. So that's going to be Sean first, then Mario, then Luigi. Okay? So then let's log to the console the HTML each time around. So save that, view in a browser, and we can see we have a little template now for each individual name. Awesome. So then one more thing before we close up, just a little bit of terminology. You might hear me and other developers in the future talk about cycling through an array or some data as iteration. And each iteration is one cycle through. So every time we perform a code block, that is one iteration through the data. Okay, so that was just a bit of terminology. That is all. We're just cycling through the data. It's the same thing. So my friends, that is a for loop. In the next video, I'm going to shift our focus to another type of loop called a while loop, which is similar, but just a bit of different syntax.